So we're going to talk about how the firm does its production cost and profit maximization from the short run perspective. So the distinction between short and long run is that in the short run, there's some things you cannot change. For instance, the lease on your building or that super big machine you just bought. But in the long run, all inputs become variable. Now you have time to decide, should you increase to a bigger size warehouse? Should you sell off that machine, etc.? So what we want to think about is that the firm will choose its fixed cost based on the level of output. So in the long run, you're picking your quantity, and then you're picking the correct firm or plant size to go with it. So there's this idea of a long run average total cost curve or average cost curve. There's no distinction between fixed and variable cost anymore, so that can sort of drop out. All costs are part of total cost. And so the idea is that you're going to choose the lowest fixed cost appropriate to the output level you want. And what you can do is map out, like, if different output levels, here are the different plant sizes that we would have, and we choose the one that's the lowest cost for the appropriate output. So what you want to do is choose the level of fixed input or the size of your firm, basically, which minimizes the average cost at the quantity that you want. So an example is, why does Chicago have more snowplow equipment, big fixed cost, built up than Washington, D.C.? Because the amount of snowplow service is much higher in Chicago. So it makes sense to have more of a fixed cost. So pretty quickly you start seeing that there can be some patterns. You might notice that as your industry grows larger, the average cost of production drops, because as firms get larger, there may be what we call economies of scale, where it gets cheaper on average to produce as you get bigger. Related to the idea of increasing returns to scale, although not quite exactly the same thing. And then decreasing returns to scale, or diseconomies of scale, usually relate to the thing that as you get bigger, your average costs are rising. And then constant returns to scale are when the average cost is unchanged as you get bigger. So we'll talk about where those diseconomies and economies of scale can come from in a minute. But first, let's look at how it graphs. So let's say we start at point A, we're at making 3 units of output, and you decide you want to produce more. Should you get a bigger plant size or not? Well, this first little U shape here is the average total cost curve for plant size 3. So a smallish size. Look, we also have them for 6 and 9. But if we stay with this plant size of 3, what's going to start happening is we run out of room, and we all know what happens as we run out of room in our little crowded coffee shop, that the law of diminishing marginal product begins to happen. Your variable input, probably workers, gets crowded, starts reducing productivity because there's just a limited amount of space. And so quickly that marginal cost begins to rise, and you're going to get, you're getting over into this area here where as you produce more, it's starting to cost more, right? You can see the costs are rising sort of with every additional output there. So revisiting the decision about should we build the bigger plant size, well, it looks like there's this point here where as we go, as we continue producing at this plant size, this point where it crosses over this next average cost curve shows the point where it would actually be cheaper, lower cost, right, by looking over at the vertical axis, if we bounced into the new bigger plant size. So at a quantity of 5, the average cost is cheaper if we're at this ATC 6, right? So that starts this curve right here, ATC 6, that starts being a better deal than the lower plant size, right? At 5, the cost per unit, if we switch into the new bigger plant size, is like 3, whereas if we stayed in the old smaller plant size, it'd be, something higher. So we lower our costs by getting into the bigger plant size. And then the same thing's going to happen, right? We decide 6 is the correct output. Well, it seems like we want to be in the middle plant size, but that's going to change, right? If, let's say we're producing 9, anything above, what does it look like, 7.5? It looks like it's going to start to be cheaper to get into the bigger plant size. So it's contextual, right? If we want to produce 9, it's cheapest to get into the big plant size. If we want to produce 6, the most cost-efficient plant size is ATC 6, or the plant size, the medium plant size. And then if it were 3, obviously it would be the smaller plant size. So it's appropriate, depending on how much you think you're going to produce. So putting it all together, we can say like the firm's only going to choose those output levels that are basically, the lowest cost at every, they're going to choose the plant size based on the lowest cost at every output level. So simplifying it, we just make a gigantic basket under all these cost curves and say that's basically your long run average cost curve. Some real life examples of economies of scale, where you have big upfront fixed costs, are going to have lots of economies of scale. There's going to be a lot of room to grow and get cheaper. Same with these ones with a huge sort of upfront cost of development or of putting out infrastructure. Cable TV is a good example of that back in the day. Other sources of economies of scale can be falling costs, for instance, as you sort of get better at productivity and specialized, that you can feel increases in productivity, which cuts your average cost. Also volume discounts. For instance, if you're buying something and as you get bigger, you get a volume discount, that's going to push down your price as well. Constant returns to scale are an interesting case, and that is just, it doesn't really change as you get bigger. You're basically getting bigger, but on average the cost is not dropping or increasing. And we think that probably a lot of firms will, once they find their the point where economies of scale finishes, it just kind of stays flat. There are some cases where it might get larger. If you have a situation where you're growing and the costs begin to creep up on average, you've run into diseconomies of scale. This can come from a pushing up of the input market price, right? So for instance, you're a hospital in a small town and you're hiring nurses. Those nurses, you're going to run out of them at some point. So as you grow, you need to hire more nurses, and there's no more left in town. So you've got to go to the next town, and you've got to somehow get those nurses who are already working for somebody else to come work for you. That's going to cause an increase. You're going to have to pay them more, and that's going to push up your average cost. Also, oversight can be a headache. So if we're talking about administrative tasks, as you get larger, sometimes it just gets to be, doctor's offices are typically not super huge because it just doesn't make sense. As you get bigger, the oversight and the messiness, the chaos of coordination of everything just gets to be too much of a burden. And it's important to note that it's more than just a headache. It's actually a decline in productivity. Emails are getting lost. All the forms done in duplicate or triplicate or being docu-signed, we lose track of them. Those things can slow down production, which increases costs. So it's worth noting that economies of scale and returns to scale are not exactly the same. You can, hang with me here for a second, you can have increasing returns to scale that cause economies of scale for sure. So increasing returns to scale is simply a productivity number. So if you double the number of inputs, what happens to the number of the outputs? It's not actually a cost function, right? So usually if you double inputs and you get more than double the output, other things equal, that is going to also be cheaper on average, right? You're going to get economies of scale. But on the reverse, you can get economies of scale that have nothing to do with increasing returns to scale. For instance, those volume discounts we already talked about. If I grow double my inputs and my outputs triple, or sorry, my outputs just double, so actually I've got, I haven't increased my returns to scale at all, but because my suppliers have given me a price cut, volume discount, it's cheaper for me even though my productivity levels haven't changed at all. And then likewise, on the decreasing returns to scale versus diseconomies of scale, the returns to scale measures just output, so or measures productivity of inputs into output. So as you double your inputs, if you get less than that in output, your productivity is starting to drop. So usually, other things equal, that's going to start costing you more on average, but you could have decreasing returns to scale, so your productivity levels might be dropping, but it's not necessarily getting more expensive. For instance, if you're a farm and you expand into less productive farmland, right, the quality of the farmland is dropped, and so you're going to get lower productivity, but oftentimes that land is cheaper. So you make up for the lower productivity by paying less for it. So your average cost might not actually change. And now we turn to economies of scope, which are just a look at the makeup of products that you're doing. So should we focus our scope on just 2 products? Should we do 7 products? And it's a fairly complex question. It depends on a lot of things. Future projections, it depends on the structure of the industry. But we can focus on part of this question. But first, some terms. So economies of scope relate to a situation where the total cost of production is lower when you have multiple outputs than if you were to do them separately. I'll explain more. Diseconomies of scope will be when the total cost is higher with the joint production than if they were to say separate in separate firms. So here's an example that may be fairly obvious. Should a newspaper produce 2 different publications, right? So if we were to stay separate, the Daily Globe and the Afternoon Globe would cost, so the cost of everything together is going to be $30,400. And what we notice is that there can be some shared costs, right? So if you think about the printing press, perhaps some of the ink, some of the labor can be shared between both. So if it's true, and it is in this case, that we combine the production of those 2 goods, maybe there's a merger, an acquisition, we're going to get a lower overall cost. So that is economies of scope. It makes sense for those 2 firms to combine into one. Now, is this legal? Will the Justice Department approve this merger? That depends on if the Justice Department thinks it drops competition too much, because mergers and acquisitions have to be run through the Justice Department and run through all of our anti-monopoly or antitrust law. We have laws in place to protect competition. Adam Smith would be proud. So what's going on in causing some of these economies of scope? Well, if, like the newspapers, you have a joint input or joint cost, you can use it for both products. Advertising is a good example of a shared or joint cost. Some other real-world examples: AT&T telephone service and DSL internet service using the same wire network. Charter doing cable, TV, and internet using the same wires. Common operating systems, touchscreen technology, etc. is an Apple joint cost. Here's one more locally. The Orfalea College of Business was considering an executive MBA program in Santa Barbara. Is that a good idea? Is it economies of scope? What is it? So UCSB was also looking at it, and they have faced higher costs because they don't already have faculty doing something like that. So faculty are a joint cost. Just increasing the size of the local MBA program would be an economies of scale question, if it worked out that way, and economies of scope if we were to branch out and serve a different set of constituents. Notice that administration is always considering or tends to consider education as an economy of scale, where assuming things about quality, you can cram more students into classrooms and lower your average cost. And the question really that faculty often push back on is it really the same quality when you have a class full of 300 students versus a class full of 25 students? Now, just to sort of make it clear, perhaps, let's think of ridiculous alternatives that would never work. Should you open a store that has that sells white sweaters and ketchup-laden hamburgers? Probably not. Right? You want to think about the joint resources, but also think about the joint dangers. But other questions are like, should a bank merge with a competitor? That's an economy of scale. Should trucking company acquire smaller rivals? Economies of scale question. Economies of scope, should you expand into a sister or cousin type of production? Like, should an airline do its own catering, or should it outsource, right? Should a bank sell insurance? Related, but not exactly their core competency. Should a university open a medical school? So until now, we've been making the case that all firms choose the quantity and then they back into the planning. But could you make the case that you should decide what your resources look like and then do the planning? And then do the planning? Well, I've convinced at least the dogs that might be the way to go. So, under what conditions should you choose the quantity first and do the planning? Or under what conditions should you focus on your resources and then go into everything else? Well, the cost approach, which is how the default that we've been using, which is decide what quantity and then minimize your cost, it can relate to this problem of it depends, right? You might not know what the cost is until you get your production level set. So there can be like a cart and a horse situation, which comes first. So this is better for if you've got an established firm already in place and are working with marginal changes, like should we increase production a little bit, or modestly, not like brand new market, don't have no idea what the size of the market is or anything. So it can be good, but it can also be myopic, short-sighted. The resource focus, looking at resources first, that's good for new firms or for major restructuring, because you're likely to get a bigger change out of that one. You've kind of gone sky's the limit, right, with the choices available. And then we want to end by elaborating on something that we've done before, and that is this idea of, it goes back to the idea of profit maximizing and benefit behavior. We keep doing something, consuming, producing, whatever, something until the additional benefit just equals the additional cost, right? And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. We want to sort of grab all the benefits that we can. So all of the units where the additional benefit outweigh the additional cost, we want to do those because they yield positive benefit to us. And then we want to stop when they no longer do. So the value of the marginal product of labor, also known as the marginal revenue product of labor, is that contribution that employees make to their firm that they work for, right? The value of their marginal product. And I'll call it the MRP of L here. It's just simply, let's say she makes 10 yo-yos for you. Each of them costs $5. She has generated $50 worth of revenue for you. But what did that depend on? So this gets a little bit into the labor market here. The fact that she generated $50 for you has something to do with stuff outside of her control. Some of it's under her control, but most of it's not. She does not decide the market price of the yo-yos. Market conditions do that. So she may get less productive if people stop paying for yo-yos and the price of yo-yos goes down, right? If yo-yos get less popular, price drops as demand drops, and you're going to get a less valuable employee, even though her productivity has not changed. Also, her productivity depends on, how she did in yo-yo school or any other number of human capital sort of training that you might have done for her. But it also depends on the machines you've given her for yo-yos, right? Are there adequate numbers of machines that help her do the production process, etc.? So we can say her value depends on the price and her productivity, and her productivity depends in part on other things besides her own work effort. So in that sense, demand for labor or demand for any resource is a derived demand, derived from the yo-yo market itself, from the good that she is creating for you. So the finding that we came back to was that you want to keep hiring workers until the additional revenue generated from that worker, the marginal revenue product of labor, is just equal to her wage rate. That's the price of labor, right? But remember, the true wage to you, if you're hiring her, is includes benefits, right? That's the full cost of the worker. And so a question here for you, as healthcare costs have risen much faster than inflation in the U.S., and most people get their healthcare through their employer, what happens, do you think, to wages, other things equal, as healthcare costs rise? Is that one of the reasons why wages have not risen over the last 40 years very much, real wages, is that our benefits packages have risen, but we're not getting more benefit. It's just that healthcare is getting more expensive. So our wages plus healthcare has risen. Our wages have not. Healthcare costs have risen. And the reason to bring that in here is that why are we putting up with it, right? Why, as workers get more productive, are we putting up with no more wage, no more compensation? And that is, we're not very elastic. We're not very sensitive. So this is elasticity of supply. We're not all that sensitive. We're willing to take pay cuts if we don't have a lot of choices, especially. And in general, we think that workers have lower wage sensitivity than employers. Workers need their job more than employers need that one particular worker. But here's what it looks like to do the MRP equals PL rule. So marginal revenue product declines, right? As output level is increasing, you're finding that the worker's price times marginal product of labor begins to decline. Not probably because the price declines, but because of the law of diminishing marginal product. In the short run, this is going to happen. We're going to get less productivity. Productivity is going to dry up somewhat because of being crowded. So that means there's going to be a clear point of, if the wage is here, a clear point where you stop hiring when the marginal revenue product just crosses the wage rate. For any worker beyond that, let's say like you want to hire this worker, doesn't make sense because she's going to cost you, let's say the wage is 30, but she's only going to earn you, let's say 25. And so that's going to reduce your profit, right? You're going to have to pay more than you receive from that worker. So the cost is outweighing the benefit, not worth it, right? You don't want to do that. And just to add nuance and complexity, because it's there already, and probably some of you are thinking about this, let's talk about other reasons why you may need or want to pay more than is suggested by that MRP equals PL rule. In other words, why you might want to actually jack up the price above what the market is telling you to do. And one of the things is to reduce turnover, especially in a tight labor market. People have lots of choices and they might just bail and bounce and go somewhere else. If you pay above what others are paying, that's going to perhaps elicit more loyalty, productivity, and for sure reduce your turnover costs of having to retrain, or having to train rather. And then in a tight labor market, like with you're that hospital hiring in a small town and you need more nurses, you've got to show them the money. And that could be a reason why you would want to push up the wage. But on the flip side, once word gets back about these new higher paid nurses, words feeds back through to the incumbent nurses, they're probably going to want, for good reason, their pay increased as well. And this is actually going to be a much higher cost than it originally looks. You're going to have to pay not just the new nurses higher, but also all the existing nurses. So the actual cost of your new hire has to include all of the back pay to the incumbent workers. And last but not least, this idea of economic rent, and that is this. Look at let's just talk about LeBron James or some other athlete with rare talent. If the skills that they own are rare, then it's going to be hard to get more LeBrons into the market. In other words, the elasticity of supply of inputs is low. So even if the wage is super high for LeBron level talent, there's just not that many people in existence that can do that, right? So the elasticity of supply is pretty low. There's new basketball players aren't just, at that level, aren't born every day. So you're not going to be able to get more LeBrons. And LeBron, as a result, can charge a lot of money for that rare talent. So you're in a position where his marginal revenue product is above a lot of other people's wage rate. And so he can, because he's in such high demand and so rare, he can actually force you to pay all the way up to the marginal revenue product rather than paying what everybody else is getting. So that idea is what economic rent is. If you own a scarce resource, you can charge a lot of people for it, related or not to to everything else. Your scarcity can earn you money. And the very final thing is, on the happy note, when you're doing planning, don't forget that you can and will get more productive as you figure it out. This is called the learning curve, right? So average cost per unit, other things equal, can drop simply as you grow up and understand the production process more and develop specialization. So cumulative units produced, as you produce 1 to 400 to next year, at the end of next year, you've produced 10,000, right? Watch your learning curve and see what happens to your average cost per unit. It may drop. So there's that always to think about as well. In planning, it's hard to plan for, but most production processes, the wrinkles get ironed out over time. Unless you live in COVID and the supply chain gets disrupted. Another story.